The sound of hammering echoed through the quiet morning streets of Malad City, Idaho, as Josephine Adams clung to the wooden post of her front porch, watching the horizon with tired eyes. She'd been up since before dawn, her stomach churning with a mixture of hope and disappointment, the same feelings that had haunted her for the past 3 years of marriage. The doctor's words still rang in her ears from yesterday's visit, cold and clinical like the metal instruments he'd used during her examination. It was the spring of 1882, and at 26, Josephine had just received news that shattered her world. She would never bear children. The condition, the doctor explained, was something she'd likely been born with. He'd cleared his throat awkwardly before suggesting that perhaps her husband might want to seek other arrangements, a euphemism that burned like acid in her heart. Yorick Xavier adjusted his worn leather gloves and continued hammering the loose board on the general store's steps. At 31, he'd built a respectable reputation as one of the hardest-working ranchers in the territory. His cattle operation outside town employed 6 men, and despite the harsh Idaho winters and occasional dry spells, he'd managed to turn a profit 4 years running. But this morning, his mind wasn't on cattle prices or the threat of rustlers. It was on his wife, and the news the doctor had delivered. "Xavier," called Frederick Thornton, the store's owner and town gossip. "Heard about your situation. Mighty unfortunate." The older man leaned against his doorframe, watching Yorick work with feigned casualness. Yorick paused, his hammer suspended in mid-air. "What situation would that be, Fred?" "Well, you know, about Josephine. Doc Wheaton mentioned it to my Clarice when she was picking up her tonic yesterday." Frederick lowered his voice, though the street was nearly empty. "Said she can't give you young'uns. Terrible shame for a strapping fella like yourself." The hammer came down with extra force, driving the nail deep into the wood. "My wife's health is our business," Yorick replied, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. Frederick continued as if he hadn't heard. "Henderson's girl, you remember Violet? She's been asking after you. Pretty little thing, and from good breeding stock, if you catch my meaning." Yorick stood, towering over the shopkeeper. His blue eyes, normally warm as a summer sky, had turned cold as winter ice. "Let me make something clear, Thornton. Josephine Adams Xavier is my wife. The only wife I'll ever have or want. But a man needs heirs, Yorick. Someone to carry on the name, work the land when you're gone." Yorick gathered his tools with deliberate calm. "They said she'd never bear me a child," he said, his voice carrying in the morning air. Then he looked straight at Frederick, his expression softening. "Then she already bore my heart, and that's worth more than a dozen heirs." He tipped his hat to the now speechless shopkeeper and strode down the street toward home, his boots kicking up dust that glittered gold in the morning light. Josephine saw her husband approaching and quickly wiped away her tears. She'd been married to Yorick long enough to read his expressions, and the set of his jaw told her all she needed to know. Word was already spreading. Her hands trembled as she smoothed her apron, wondering if this would be the day he'd finally realize he'd married wrong. "Morning, Joe," Yorick called, removing his hat as he climbed the steps. "You're back early," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I thought you had repairs all over town today. Some things are more important." He set his toolbox down and took her hands in his. His palms were rough with calluses, warm against her cold fingers. Thornton was running his mouth about what the doctor said. Josephine's face flushed with shame. "I'm so sorry, Yorick. I understand if you don't," he interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Don't you dare apologize, and don't you dare think for one moment that this changes anything between us." "But you always wanted children," she whispered. "A big family, sons to help with the ranch." Yorick brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face. I wanted you, Josephine. Everything else was just details. The town will talk. Let them. He pulled her close, the scent of sawdust and leather enveloping her. We've got each other, and that's all that matters. As Josephine rested her head against her husband's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, she wanted desperately to believe him. But she knew their world well enough to understand that in frontier towns like Malad City, a woman's worth was often measured by the children she bore. And now, having failed at what many considered her primary purpose, she wondered how long Yorick's love could withstand the pressure that would surely come. That evening they sat at their dining table, the food barely touched. The small house that had once felt cozy now seemed to echo with emptiness spaces that would never be filled with children's laughter or the patter of little feet. I was thinking, Yorick said suddenly, breaking the silence, about expanding the operation. Taking on that parcel west of Simmons Creek. Josephine nodded absently, pushing her potatoes around her plate. And he continued, I was wondering if you might want to come with me tomorrow to look at it. It's beautiful land, Joe, rolling hills, good water access. The kind of view that makes you want to build something lasting. She looked up, surprised. Yorick rarely invited her along on his business matters. Why would you want me there? He reached across the table for her hand. Because I don't make decisions about our future without you. And because when I look at that land, I see possibilities, different from what we planned maybe, but still ours. The lump in her throat made it hard to speak. What possibilities? We've got love, Joe. We've got skills. We've got more than most in this territory. Maybe instead of focusing on what we can't have, we think about what we can give. For the first time since the doctor's visit, Josephine felt a flutter of something besides despair. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet, but perhaps its distant cousin. What are you saying, Yorick? I'm saying I want us to build a life that's meaningful, with or without children of our own. And I'm saying I want to do it with you. The next morning dawned clear and crisp, the kind of spring day that held summer's promise. Yorick saddled their horses while Josephine packed a simple lunch. She wore her riding skirt and a blue blouse that matched her eyes' clothes she hadn't bothered with in weeks, having lost interest in her appearance as depression settled over her. They rode west along Simmons Creek, the water glinting silver in the morning light. Birds called from the cottonwoods and the scent of wildflowers hung in the air. As they crested a gentle hill, Yorick reined his horse to a stop. There it is, he said, gesturing to the valley below. 200 acres, give or take. Josephine caught her breath. The land unfolded like a painting, rolling grasslands bordered by stands of aspen, the creek winding through like a silver ribbon. In the distance, mountains rose purple against the sky. It's beautiful, she whispered. It could be ours. He dismounted and helped her down from her horse. We could build here, Joe. Not just a house, but something more. They spread a blanket under a tall cottonwood and shared the bread and cheese she'd packed. Yorick pointed out features of the land, explaining his vision for expanded cattle operations, perhaps some crops. Josephine listened, trying to see the future he described, but her mind kept returning to the empty nursery in their home, the cradle Yorick had crafted that would never rock a baby to sleep. You're not hearing me, are you? He asked gently, noting her distracted gaze. I'm sorry, she sighed. I just keep thinking, what's the point of building all this if there's no one to leave it to? Yorick was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the distant mountains. My pa used to say that a man's legacy isn't just in his bloodline, it's in what he builds, what he contributes. He turned to face her. Joe, have you ever thought about the Wilkerson place? The question seemed to come from nowhere. The Wilkerson place was an orphanage on the outskirts of Malad City, run by a stern but well-meaning widow and perpetually short on resources. What about it? She asked. They've got 15 children there now, too many for old Mrs. Wilkerson to handle properly, even with help from the church ladies. He took her hand. I was thinking, maybe we could help there. Maybe there are children already in this world who need us, even if they didn't come from us. Josephine stared at him, 1,000 thoughts racing through her mind. You mean, take in orphans, at first maybe just help out, see how it feels. He squeezed her hand. Joe, I know this isn't what we planned, but plans change. Life changes us. The only thing that doesn't change is how I feel about you. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in days, they weren't tears of despair. Do you really think we could? I think we can try. The following Sunday, after church services, Josephine found herself standing before the weathered door of the Wilkerson Orphan Asylum. The 2-story wooden structure had seen better days, its paint peeling and shutters hanging askew. From inside came the sounds of children, some laughing, some crying, all contributing to a chaotic chorus that made Josephine's heart race with apprehension. We don't have to do this today, Yorick said, sensing her hesitation. No, she replied, squaring her shoulders. I want to, Mrs. Wilkerson, a wiry woman of 60 with iron-gray hair and permanent frown lines, answered their knock. Her expression softened slightly at the sight of Yorick, whose donations of beef had kept the orphanage fed through more than one hard winter. Mr. Xavier, she acknowledged, then glanced curiously at Josephine. Mrs. Xavier, this is unexpected. We were hoping to help out today, Yorick explained. My wife has a way with children, and we thought perhaps an extra pair of hands might be welcome. Mrs. Wilkerson's eyebrows rose. The Lord works in mysterious ways, she said, stepping aside to let them enter. Miss Collins took ill this morning, and I'm short-handed as it is. The interior of the orphanage was clean but sparse. Wooden tables and benches filled what had once been a formal dining room, while the parlor had been converted to a classroom of sorts, with a blackboard and rows of mismatched chairs. Children of various ages moved through the spaces, some engaged in chores, others playing quiet games. The little ones need attending, Mrs. Wilkerson told Josephine, leading her toward a back room. Can you manage reading stories while I see to lunch preparations? Josephine nodded, her throat suddenly dry. The nursery contained 6 children under the age of 5, playing with simple wooden toys on a worn rug. They looked up with curious eyes as Josephine entered. A little girl with blonde braids approached immediately. Are you my new mama? She asked, her blue eyes solemn. The question hit Josephine like a physical blow. No, sweetheart, she managed. I'm Mrs. Xavier. I've come to read stories. Oh. The child's disappointment was palpable but short-lived. I'm Ellie, I'm 4, I like stories about horses. Well then, Josephine said, finding her voice, shall we find a book about horses? She settled on a wooden stool and soon had all 6 children gathered around her as she read from a tattered copy of Black Beauty. Their faces, upturned and attentive, stirred something in her chest that felt dangerously like longing. Meanwhile, Yorick found himself in the yard with the older boys, organizing an impromptu baseball game with a makeshift ball of twine and leather scraps. Among them was Daniel, a serious 12-year-old with dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing. You're Mr. Xavier, the cattle rancher, Daniel said during a pause in the game. I heard Mrs. Wilkerson say you're the one who brings the Christmas beef. Yorick nodded. That's right. Why'd you come today? It's not Christmas. The directness of the question made Yorick smile. Sometimes helping out isn't just for holidays. Daniel considered this. My pa used to say people only do good when they want something in return. Your pa got that wrong, Yorick replied. Sometimes folks do good because it's the right thing to do. The boy's skeptical expression suggested he'd heard such platitudes before and found them wanting. "You got family?" Daniel asked. "Just my wife." "No kids?" Yorick hesitated. "No. That's why you're here, isn't it?" Daniel's perception was unsettling. "You're looking to take one of us home." Before Yorick could respond, a commotion from the porch drew their attention. A young woman had arrived with a bundle in her arms and was speaking urgently to Mrs. Wilkerson. Even from a distance, Yorick could see the woman's distress and the tiny form wrapped in a faded quilt. "That's Miss Rachel," Daniel explained. "She teaches at the Indian school up north. Sometimes she brings babies that nobody wants." The casual way the boy delivered this information struck Yorick like a slap. "Babies nobody wants," Daniel shrugged. "Half-breeds, mostly. White fathers don't claim them and the tribes won't take them either." He picked up the makeshift ball. "They don't usually last long here. Too small and misses. Wilkerson doesn't have enough help." Yorick watched as Mrs. Wilkerson accepted the bundle, her expression grave. The young woman, Miss Rachel, wiped tears from her eyes before climbing back onto her wagon and departing. By the time Josephine and Yorick left the orphanage that evening, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in shades of orange and gold. They rode in silence for a time, each lost in thought about the day's experiences. "There was a baby brought in while you were reading to the children," Yorick finally said. Josephine nodded. "Mrs. Wilkerson showed me, a little girl, barely 2 months old. Her mother died in childbirth and the father—" She trailed off. "Abandoned her because she's half Shoshone," Yorick finished. "Daniel told me it happens often. Her name is Sarah." Josephine's voice caught. "She's so tiny, Yorick, and Mrs. Wilkerson says they don't have proper milk for her, just watered-down cow's milk that's making her sick." Yorick reached across to take her hand. "What are you thinking, Joe?" "I'm thinking we have a perfectly good nursery sitting empty," she said, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess herself. "I'm thinking that maybe this is what you meant about seeing possibilities." Yorick's smile was slow and warm. "I was thinking the same thing, but bringing Sarah home proved more complicated than either of them anticipated." The following day, they returned to the orphanage with a formal offer to foster the infant, only to be met with unexpected resistance from Mrs. Wilkerson. "It's not as simple as just taking her," the matron explained. "There are procedures, paperwork. The territorial authority needs to approve any placement." "But you said yourself she needs proper care," Josephine argued. "Care you can't provide here." "And what happens when your husband decides he wants a real child?" Mrs. Wilkerson asked bluntly. "What happens when you tire of playing mother to an Indian baby?" Yorick stepped forward. "With all due respect, Mrs. Wilkerson, my wife and I don't consider caring for a child who needs us to be playing at anything. And Sarah would be as real a child to us as any." The matron's expression softened slightly. "Your intentions may be good, Mr. Xavier, but I've seen too many children returned when the novelty wears off. It breaks them in ways that never heal." "Then let us prove ourselves," Josephine pleaded. "Let us care for her while the paperwork is processed. If we haven't shown ourselves worthy after that, we'll accept your judgment." After further discussion, a compromise was reached. The Xaviers would visit Sarah daily, bringing the goat's milk that Mrs. Wilkerson agreed would be better for the infant than what they had available. They would help with her care, and if after 2 weeks the arrangement seemed successful, they could apply for formal fostering. Those 2 weeks changed everything. Each morning, Josephine woke with a renewed sense of purpose. She and Yorick would complete their ranch chores with efficient haste, then ride to town with fresh milk and supplies. Hours spent holding Sarah, feeding her, bathing her tiny form, and singing lullabies filled a void in Josephine's heart she hadn't fully acknowledged. Meanwhile, Yorick found himself drawn to the older children, particularly Daniel, whose sharp mind and quick wit reminded him of himself at that age. He began bringing tools and teaching basic carpentry to the boys, showing them how to repair the orphanage's sagging porch and loose shutters. "You're good with them," Mrs. Wilkerson observed one afternoon, watching Yorick patiently demonstrate how to measure twice before cutting lumber. "They're good boys," he replied. "Just need someone to see their potential." "And the baby?" she asked. "How is Mrs. Xavier managing?" Yorick glanced through the window to where Josephine sat in a rocking chair, Sarah nestled against her shoulder. "She was born to be a mother," he said simply. "Just not the way we expected." The transformation in his wife hadn't escaped his notice. The light had returned to her eyes, and her smile, absent for so long now, came easily and often. She'd begun talking about the future again, making plans instead of dwelling in regret. At the end of the 2 weeks, Mrs. Wilkerson called them into her office. The usually stern woman's expression was unreadable as she shuffled through papers on her desk. "Sarah has gained weight," she began. "Her coloring is better and she's more alert. Your care has made a difference." Josephine squeezed Yorick's hand, hope rising in her chest. "I've sent your application to the territorial authority," Mrs. Wilkerson continued, "but these things take time, months sometimes, and—" she hesitated. "There may be complications because of the child's heritage." "What complications?" Yorick asked. "Some officials have strong feelings about placing Indian children with white families. They may argue she belongs with her mother's people." "But you said her mother's family rejected her," Josephine protested. "Yes, but politics often override practicalities." Mrs. Wilkerson sighed. "In the meantime, I've been authorized to place her in your temporary care, as her health has clearly benefited from your attention." The joy Josephine felt at bringing Sarah home was tempered by the uncertainty of the arrangement. As they settled the infant into the long, empty cradle, Yorick wrapped his arms around his wife's waist. "One day at a time," he murmured against her hair. "That's all we can do." "What if they don't let us keep her?" Josephine whispered, watching the baby's peaceful sleep. "Then we'll have given her the best start we could," he answered honestly. "And we'll keep finding ways to help children who need us." The spring days lengthened into summer, and Sarah flourished in the Xavier home. Her dark eyes grew bright and curious, her tiny fists reaching for the world around her. Josephine bloomed as well, the purpose of motherhood even uncertain, temporary motherhood healing wounds she'd thought permanent. Word of their fostering arrangement spread through Malad City with predictable results. Some, like the pastor's wife and the schoolteacher, expressed support and admiration. Others, like Frederick Thornton and his circle, responded with thinly veiled disapproval. "Seems a peculiar choice," Frederick commented when Yorick came to the general store for supplies. "Taking in a half-breed when there are perfectly good white orphans available." Yorick measured coffee beans into a sack with deliberate care before responding. "Sarah needed a home, Thornton. Her background doesn't change that." "Still," the merchant persisted, "people wonder about the wisdom of it. What with the tensions between settlers and Indians these past years." "Sarah is a baby," Yorick said flatly, "not a political statement." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James Henderson, a wealthy rancher from the north end of the valley. His daughter Violet, the one Frederick had mentioned months earlier as potential wife material, stood at his side, her blonde curls arranged artfully beneath her bonnet. "Xavier," Henderson greeted him with a nod. "Heard you've taken up charity work." Yorick's jaw tightened. "Not charity, Henderson, family." "Is that what you call it?" The older man's tone made it clear what he thought of the arrangement. "Well, I suppose it's one way to handle disappointment." Before Yorick could respond, Violet stepped forward. "Father, I'd like to call on Mrs. Xavier sometime. Perhaps see the baby." Her innocent question diffused some of the tension, though Yorick noted the calculating look in Henderson's eyes. "You'd be welcome," he told Violet. "Josephine doesn't get many visitors these days." It was true. Many of the town women who had once called on Josephine regularly now found excuses to stay away. Whether from disapproval of Sarah's heritage or discomfort with the Xaviers' unconventional family arrangement, the result was increased isolation for Josephine. Violet Henderson's visit the following week was therefore a welcome break from routine. The young woman arrived with a small gift, a handmade baby blanket of soft blue wool, and genuine curiosity about Sarah. "She's beautiful," Violet exclaimed, watching the baby kick her feet on a quilt spread before the fireplace. "Look at those eyes, so alert." Josephine warmed to the younger woman's unfeigned admiration. "She's growing stronger every day. The doctor says she's caught up to where she should be for her age." "And you did that," Violet said admiringly. "Everyone says she was sickly when she came to the orphanage." "We're just giving her what any child deserves," Josephine demurred. "Good food, clean surroundings, love." Violet's expression grew wistful. "It must be wonderful caring for a baby, even with the difficulties." "It is," Josephine agreed, "though I worry about the future. The territorial authority hasn't decided yet if we can adopt her permanently." "Why ever not?" Violet seemed genuinely perplexed. "Anyone can see she's thriving with you." Josephine hesitated, unsure how much to share with Henderson's daughter. "There are complications because of her background." Understanding dawned in Violet's eyes. "Because she's half Indian, that's ridiculous. She's a baby who needs a family." The young woman's indignation was unexpected and touching. "Not everyone sees it that way," Josephine said gently. "Well, they should," Violet declared. "And I'll tell them so, starting with my father." After Violet left, promising to return soon, Josephine found herself smiling. Perhaps not everyone in Malad City was as judgmental as she'd feared. Her optimism was short-lived. The following Sunday, as she and Yorick entered the church with Sarah bundled in her arms, a hush fell over the congregation. Whispers followed them to their usual pew, and more than one family shifted to create distance. Pastor Moore's sermon that morning, on the topic of natural order and God's design for families, felt pointed in a way his messages usually weren't. While he never directly mentioned the Xaviers or Sarah, the implication was clear in phrases like the mixing of peoples against divine intent and the presumption of improving upon nature's plan. Yorick's hand found Josephine's, squeezing gently in silent support. She cradled Sarah closer, the baby's warm weight against her chest a reminder of what truly mattered. After the service, as they made their way toward the door, Pastor Moore intercepted them. "Mr. and Mrs. Xavier," he greeted them, his expression serious. "I wonder if I might call on you tomorrow. There are matters I believe we should discuss." "Of course, Pastor," Yorick replied, his tone neutral despite the tension Josephine could feel radiating from him. Outside, they found Daniel waiting by their wagon, hands thrust deep in his pockets. The boy had been a regular visitor since they'd started fostering Sarah, often riding out to the ranch to help with chores or simply to escape the confines of the orphanage. "Mrs. Wilkerson said I could come for Sunday dinner," he announced without preamble, "if that's still all right." "Always," Yorick assured him, helping Josephine and the baby into the wagon before turning to offer Daniel a hand up. As they drove away from the church, Josephine noticed the stares and whispers following them. "It's getting worse," she said quietly. Yorick nodded. Pastor Moore's sermon wasn't subtle. "What do you think he wants to discuss tomorrow?" "Nothing good." Yorick's expression was grim. "But whatever it is, we'll face it together." Daniel, listening to their exchange, leaned forward from the back of the wagon. "It's because of Sarah being mixed, isn't it? That's why they're acting strange." Yorick glanced back at the boy. "Partly. And partly because people don't like what they don't understand. Like how they treat me different because my ma was Irish Catholic and my pa was a drifter." Daniel's perception was, as usual, uncomfortably accurate. "Something like that," Josephine agreed. "Well, they're stupid then," Daniel declared with the absolute confidence of youth. "Sarah's just a baby. She didn't ask to be born who she is." "No," Yorick said softly. "None of us do." Pastor Moore arrived the following afternoon, his usual friendly demeanor replaced by solemn purpose. He accepted tea in the Xavier's modest parlor, his eyes moving over the evidence of Sarah's presence: the cradle in the corner, the tiny garments hung to dry by the fire, the rattle carved by Yorick's own hands. "I'll be direct," he said after preliminary pleasantries. "There's concern in the community about your arrangement with the half-Indian child." "Her name is Sarah," Josephine said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "And she's been legally placed in our care by the territorial authority." "Temporarily," the pastor corrected. "And therein lies the concern. Attachments are forming on both sides that may prove detrimental when the child is eventually placed elsewhere." Yorick set down his teacup with deliberate care. "We've applied to make the arrangement permanent." "Yes, I'm aware." Pastor Moore's expression suggested this was precisely the problem. "It's about that application I've come. The territorial governor has asked for community input on the matter, and as spiritual leader of this town, my opinion carries weight." The implication hung in the air between them. "And what is your opinion, Pastor?" Yorick asked, his voice dangerously quiet. The older man hesitated. "I believe in the goodness of your intentions, but I also believe in the natural order of things. The child belongs with her own kind." "Her own kind rejected her," Josephine said, anger rising in her throat. "She was starving, sickly. We've given her health, stability, love." "For now," the pastor acknowledged. "But what about when she's older, when she faces the prejudice of a world that will never fully accept her? When she realizes she belongs nowhere, she belongs with us," Yorick stated firmly. Pastor Moore sighed. "Consider what I'm saying, please. There's a Shoshone mission some 50 miles north. The nuns there specialize in caring for children of mixed heritage. They could raise her with knowledge of both worlds." "And who would love her?" Josephine demanded. "Who would hold her when she cries, teach her to walk, to speak, to believe in herself?" "God's love is not the same as a mother's arms," she interrupted, tears threatening. "Or a father's protection." The pastor looked genuinely troubled. "I understand your feelings, Mrs. Xavier, but I must consider what's best for the child long-term and for the harmony of our community. The harmony that involves whispering about us in church." Yorick's tone was bitter. "The kind that sees a baby as a problem rather than a blessing." "You oversimplify," Pastor Moore protested. "There are real concerns about raising an Indian child in a white household." "Half Indian," Josephine corrected, "and half white. She's both. Why should one heritage erase the other?" The conversation continued in circles, neither side willing to concede. When Pastor Moore finally took his leave, his parting words hung like a cloud over the Xavier household. "I'll be writing to the governor tomorrow. I suggest you prepare yourselves for whatever decision may come." That night, after Sarah had been fed and settled in her cradle, Yorick found Josephine on the porch, staring at the stars scattered like diamond dust across the Idaho sky. "We could leave," he said, joining her on the bench. "Take Sarah and go where no one knows us. Oregon, maybe, or California." Josephine rested her head against his shoulder. "Running wouldn't solve anything. They'd question our right to her wherever we went. Then we fight, he said simply. We show them that love matters more than blood or heritage or small-minded prejudice. And if we lose, if they take her away? Yorick had no answer for that, only the warmth of his arms around her and the silent promise of his presence. The following weeks brought an unexpected ally in their struggle. Violet Henderson, true to her word, had spoken to her father about the Xaviers and Sarah. While James Henderson remained skeptical, his daughter's passionate advocacy had at least tempered his public opposition. More significantly, Violet had mobilized a group of younger women in town, daughters and wives who had been educated in Eastern schools and held more progressive views than their parents or husbands. They began visiting Josephine regularly, bringing small gifts for Sarah and offering help with household tasks. Their presence made the isolation more bearable, and their willingness to be seen publicly supporting the Xaviers gradually influenced others in the community, even Mrs. Wilkerson, initially so doubtful of their intentions, had become a cautious supporter. Her letters to the territorial authority noted Sarah's remarkable progress and the obvious devotion of her foster parents. And she continued to allow Daniel extended visits to the Xavier Ranch, tacitly acknowledging the positive influence they had on the boy. But Pastor Moore's opposition remained firm, bolstered by the conservative faction of Malad City's leadership. The waiting became its own form of torture each day, bringing Sarah deeper into their hearts while the threat of separation hung over them. By late summer, Sarah was sitting up on her own, her delighted giggles filling the house when Yorick played peekaboo or Josephine sang nursery rhymes. She had learned to recognize them, reaching out with chubby arms when they entered a room, her dark eyes lighting with joy that mirrored their own. It was Daniel who brought news that would change everything. The 12-year-old burst into the Xavier kitchen one August afternoon, breathless from his ride from town. "Mrs. Xavier," he called, "there's a lady at the orphanage asking about Sarah." Josephine's hands stilled in the dough she was kneading. "What lady?" "An Indian lady," Daniel explained, accepting the glass of water Yorick offered. "Says she's Sarah's aunt or something. Mrs. Wilkerson sent me to tell you to come quick." The ride to town was a blur, Sarah secured against Josephine's chest in a sling while Yorick pushed their horses to a pace just short of reckless. Daniel rode beside them on the pony they'd given him for his recent birthday, his young face serious with shared concern. At the orphanage, they found Mrs. Wilkerson in conversation with a slender woman dressed in a simple calico dress, her black hair braided and wrapped at the nape of her neck. She turned as they entered, revealing features that echoed Sarah's, the same high cheekbones and dark, intelligent eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Xavier," Mrs. Wilkerson said, her voice carefully neutral. "This is Miss Emma Rivers. She claims to be the sister of Sarah's mother." The woman stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the baby in Josephine's arms. "My sister was called Morning Sky by our people, but she took the name Mary when she married the white trader," she said in perfect, slightly accented English. "She died bringing this child into the world." "We were told her family didn't want the baby," Yorick said, moving protectively closer to Josephine and Sarah. Emma Rivers nodded, her expression sad. "Our father rejected her because she married outside the tribe. When she died, he refused to acknowledge the child." She hesitated. "He died last month. As eldest surviving daughter, I now have say in family matters. And you've come for Sarah," Josephine whispered, her arms tightening around the baby. "I've come to see her," Emma corrected, "to understand her situation." Her gaze moved between the Xaviers, assessing. "The missionary woman who brought her here told me she'd been placed with a white family who wanted her. I didn't believe such a thing possible." We don't just want her, Yorick said firmly. We love her. She's our daughter in every way that matters. Emma's expression remained unreadable. May I hold her? The request sent panic through Josephine. Instinct told her to refuse to protect what was hers. But reason prevailed. This woman was Sarah's blood kin, her connection to a heritage that would always be part of her. With trembling hands, she transferred the baby to Emma's arms. Sarah fussed briefly at the change, then settled, her curious eyes studying the new face above her. She has our mother's chin, Emma observed softly, and Mary's smile. She looked up at Josephine. She seems well cared for. She is, Josephine confirmed. She's happy, healthy, loved. You understand, Emma said carefully, that by our customs, she belongs with her mother's people, to be raised knowing our ways, our stories, our beliefs. And you understand, Yorick countered, that by the customs of the world she'll grow up in, having a stable home with parents who adore her matters more than tribal traditions she never knew. The tension in the room was palpable. Mrs. Wilkerson, watching from her desk, seemed uncertain whether to intervene. Daniel had positioned himself near the door, his young face a study in conflicted loyalties. Emma Rivers looked down at Sarah again, then back at the Xaviers. I teach at the mission school, she said. I see what happens to children caught between worlds. It's never easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is, Yorick replied. What are your intentions for her? Emma asked directly. Will you teach her to be ashamed of her Shoshone blood, to hide it if she can, deny it if she cannot? We want her to be proud of who she is, Josephine said, finding her voice. All of who she is. We can't teach her Shoshone ways because we don't know them, but we would never, ever ask her to deny any part of herself. Something shifted in Emma's expression, not quite approval, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. The territorial authority has asked for my opinion on your adoption application, she revealed. As her closest blood relative, my word will influence their decision. Hope and fear warred in Josephine's heart. And what will you tell them? I don't know yet. Emma handed Sarah back to Josephine, her fingers lingering briefly on the baby's soft cheek. I need time to consider what's truly best for her. Stay with us, Yorick said suddenly. At the ranch. See how we live, how we care for Sarah. Then make your decision. The invitation surprised everyone in the room, none more than Emma herself. She studied Yorick with new interest. You would welcome me into your home, knowing I might take the child you love. We have nothing to hide, he said simply. And Sarah deserves to know her mother's sister, whatever happens. After a long moment, Emma nodded. 3 days. I will stay 3 days. Those 3 days tested the Xaviers in ways they hadn't anticipated. Having Emma Rivers in their home meant constant awareness of being evaluated, judged by standards they could only guess at. They maintained their normal routines, Yorick tending to ranch business, Josephine managing household affairs, both caring for Sarah with the easy synchronicity they'd developed. Emma watched it all with quiet attentiveness. She helped with chores without being asked, demonstrated a gentle touch with Sarah, and shared stories of the baby's mother that filled gaps in what they knew of her origins. In the evenings, she taught them Shoshone words, the terms for family members, simple phrases Sarah might someday learn. You have a good life here, she observed on the second night as they sat on the porch after Sarah had been put to bed. Peaceful, prosperous. We've worked hard for it, Yorick acknowledged, and yet the town turns against you because of her. It wasn't a question, Josephine sighed. Some do, others have stood by us. It will only get harder as she grows, Emma warned. When her features become more pronounced, when strangers can see at a glance that she's not fully yours. She is fully ours, Yorick countered, just not only ours. We understand she's also her mother's daughter and her aunt's niece. Emma considered this. At the mission school, mixed-blood children are taught to favor their white heritage, to speak English, not Shoshone, to worship the white man's God, not honor our spirits. Is that what you want for her? We want her to choose her own path, Josephine said carefully. When she's old enough to understand. And if that path leads away from you, toward her mother's people, then we'll help her follow it, Yorick said, though the pain of such a possibility was evident in his voice. Because that's what parents do. They prepare children to make their own choices, even when those choices hurt. On the third morning, Daniel arrived early, carrying a letter. From the territorial authority, he explained, handing it to Yorick. Mrs. Wilkerson said it looked important. The boys' presence had become so natural in their household that none of them questioned his role as messenger. He took a seat at the breakfast table beside Emma, who had developed an unexpected rapport with him, recognizing in the orphan a kindred spirit of sorts. Yorick broke the seal on the letter, his expression growing serious as he read. "They've reached a decision," he announced. "They'll be sending a representative next week to evaluate our home and interview us. After that, they decide Sarah's fate," Josephine finished, her appetite vanishing. Emma set down her teacup. "I must return to the mission today," she said. "They're expecting me." "And what will you tell the authority when they ask about us?" Yorick asked directly. The Shoshone woman looked at each of them in turn, her gaze lingering on Sarah, who was contentedly mashing porridge between her tiny fingers. "I will tell them what I have seen," she said finally. "A child who is loved, a home that is stable. Parents who understand that raising her means respecting all that she is." Josephine felt tears prick her eyes. "Does that mean, it means," Emma interrupted gently, "that I believe my sister would be at peace knowing her daughter is cherished?" She rose from the table. "It also means that I hope you'll welcome my visits, that you'll allow me to share our people's stories with her as she grows." Yorick stood as well, extending his hand. "You'll always have a place here, Emma, your family now." The territorial representative arrived the following week, a stern-faced man named Holbrook, with a portfolio of papers and a pocket watch he consulted frequently. He inspected the Xavier home with meticulous attention to detail, asked pointed questions about their finances, their religious practices, their plans for Sarah's education. "And you understand," he said, addressing Josephine while Yorick was showing him the property, "that adopting a child of mixed race presents unique challenges, that society may not always be kind to her or to you." "Mr. Holbrook," Josephine replied, her patience wearing thin after hours of interrogation, "we've been living with those unique challenges since the day Sarah came to us. We're not naive about the prejudices she'll face, but we believe love is stronger than prejudice." The official made a non-committal note in his ledger. "I've spoken with Pastor Moore," he commented. "He has reservations." "Pastor Moore is entitled to his opinion," she said carefully, "but he doesn't know Sarah as we do. He doesn't see her smile when Yorick comes in from the fields, or hear her giggle when I tickle her toes. He doesn't hold her when she wakes crying in the night." Holbrook's expression softened slightly. "I've also received a letter from a Miss Rivers, who identifies herself as the child's maternal aunt." Josephine's heart skipped. "Yes, she speaks quite highly of you and your husband, says the child is fortunate to have found such a home." He closed his ledger. "It's unusual in my experience for Indian relatives to support white adoption." Miss Rivers cares about what's best for Sarah," Josephine explained. "She sees that we do too." "Indeed." Holbrook stood, gathering his papers. "Well, Mrs. Xavier, I believe I have everything I need. The authority will render its decision within the month." Another month of waiting, of loving Sarah each day while fearing it might be one of their last together. The strain showed in both Josephine and Yorick in the dark circles beneath their eyes, in moments of short temper quickly regretted, in the way they sometimes held Sarah too tightly, as if she might vanish if they loosened their grip. Daniel noticed, of course. The boy spent more time at the ranch than the orphanage now, having developed a knack with horses that made him genuinely useful to Yorick. One evening, as they sat at dinner, he asked the question they'd all been avoiding. What happens if they say no? If they don't let you keep Sarah? The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken fear. Josephine busied herself wiping porridge from Sarah's chin, unable to meet the boy's eyes. "Then we appeal," Yorick said finally. "We fight through legal channels as long as we can." Daniel nodded, considering this. "And if that doesn't work?" Yorick exchanged a glance with Josephine. They hadn't discussed contingency plans, both too superstitious to voice the possibility of failure. "We haven't decided," Josephine admitted. "You could run," Daniel suggested, his tone matter of fact. "Lots of places a family could disappear. My friend Billy's pa did it when the law was after him for claim jumping." "We're not criminals, Daniel," Yorick reminded him gently. "Would be if they took Sarah and you stole her back," the boy pointed out with impeccable 12-year-old logic. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Yorick answered it to find Violet Henderson on the porch, her usually perfect appearance disheveled, as if she'd ridden hard from town. "Mr. Xavier," she gasped, "you need to come quickly. There's trouble." "What kind of trouble?" he asked, ushering her inside. "It's Pastor Moore. He's called a town meeting about Sarah." Violet glanced at the baby, who was happily banging a wooden spoon on her high chair tray. "He's trying to convince people to sign a petition opposing your adoption. Says it's against God's plan." Josephine felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "When is this meeting?" "Now, at the church." Violet twisted her gloves nervously. "My father's there, most of the town council too." Yorick's jaw tightened. "Joe, stay here with Sarah and Daniel. I'll go deal with this." "No." Josephine stood, her decision immediate and unshakable. "We go together, all of us." She lifted Sarah from her high chair. "They need to see us as a family, not as some abstract moral question." "Josephine, it could get ugly. It already is ugly," she interrupted. "But I won't hide while others decide our daughter's future." The Malad City Church was packed when they arrived, voices raised in heated debate. Pastor Moore stood at the pulpit, a document in his hands that Josephine presumed was the petition. James Henderson and Frederick Thornton flanked him, their expressions self-righteous and determined. A hush fell over the congregation as the Xaviers entered, Sarah in Josephine's arms, Daniel and Violet following close behind. Yorick led them down the center aisle, his posture straight and proud despite the whispers that followed their progress. "Mr. Xavier," Pastor Moore acknowledged from the pulpit, his surprise evident. "We weren't expecting you." "Clearly," Yorick replied, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "Yet you're discussing my family, our right to be one." "This is a community matter," Frederick Thornton interjected. "The moral character of our town is reflected in how we treat the most vulnerable among us." Josephine finished for him, stepping forward. Sarah, sensing the tension, had grown quiet in her arms, her dark eyes wide as she regarded the crowd. Pastor Moore cleared his throat. "Mrs. Xavier, with all due respect, this isn't an appropriate place for a child." "And yet she's the reason we're here, isn't she?" Josephine challenged. "This perfect, innocent baby that some of you believe doesn't deserve a home with parents who love her because of who her ancestors were." "That's not fair," someone called from the pews. "It's about what's proper, natural." "There is nothing more natural than love," Yorick responded. "Nothing more proper than providing for a child who needs you." James Henderson stepped forward, his imposing figure commanding attention. "Xavier, no one disputes that you've done a charitable thing taking in the child temporarily, but adoption, making her legally yours, that crosses a line." "What line?" Yorick demanded. "The one that says a man can father a child with an Indian woman but not claim it. The one that says we should judge an infant by the circumstances of her birth rather than see her as a gift from God." The mention of God in the church setting created a ripple of discomfort. Pastor Moore seized on it. "God established order in creation," he pronounced. "Boundaries between peoples, God created love," Josephine interrupted, her voice surprisingly steady. "And commanded us to love our neighbors as ourselves. Where in Scripture does it say that love should stop at the color of a child's skin?" An unexpected voice joined the debate. Mrs. Wilkerson, whom no one had noticed entering behind them, stepped forward from the shadows at the back of the church. "I've watched children die," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "Die from lack of food, lack of care, lack of love. I've buried tiny bodies that might have grown strong with just a little more of what the Xaviers offer in abundance." She moved to stand beside Josephine, her weathered hand touching Sarah's cheek briefly. "This child was failing when she came to my orphanage. Now look at her, thriving, cherished." Her words created a murmur through the congregation. Pastor Moore frowned, clearly unhappy with this unplanned testimony. "The issue isn't whether the child is well cared for temporarily," he insisted. "It's about permanent placement, about what's best for her long term." "And who decides that?" Yorick challenged. "You, the town council, or the people who have held her through fever and colic, who know every expression on her face, every sound she makes?" Daniel, who had remained silent until now, suddenly spoke up. "I know what it's like," he said, his young voice cracking slightly with emotion. "Being an orphan. Having people decide your future like you're a package to be delivered somewhere convenient." He looked around the church, meeting the eyes of townspeople who had walked past the orphanage for years without a second thought. "Mr. and Mrs. Xavier are good people, the best I know. Sarah's lucky to have them wanting her." The simple sincerity of the boy's words landed with unexpected impact. Several women dabbed at their eyes, and even some of the men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Violet Henderson stepped forward next, placing herself deliberately between her father and the Xaviers. "If we claim to be Christians," she said, addressing the congregation, "then shouldn't we support a family that embodies Christian love? Shouldn't we celebrate the hope that Sarah represents a future where differences matter less than devotion?" James Henderson stared at his daughter with a mixture of surprise and grudging respect. Pastor Moore, sensing the mood of the room shifting, tried to regain control. "The petition merely expresses concern," he clarified. "It doesn't prevent the adoption outright. It prejudices the territorial authority against us," Yorick corrected. "It tells them this community rejects Sarah as one of its own. Is that truly what Malad City stands for?" The question hung in the air, challenging each person present to examine their conscience. Frederick Thornton, never one to back down easily, spoke up. "It's not about rejecting the child. It's about maintaining proper order. Would you have all of us ignore the natural divisions that there is nothing natural about denying a child a loving home?" Josephine interrupted, her patience finally exhausted. "Nothing proper about judging her for circumstances beyond her control." She looked around the church, meeting the eyes of women she'd known for years. "Many of you have held Sarah, brought gifts when she came to us," exclaimed over her smile, her bright eyes, the way she reaches for familiar faces. She took a deep breath, gathering courage. "Ask yourselves, if she were fully white, would we be having this meeting? Would anyone question our right to love her as our own? If your answer is no, then what does that say about the true nature of your concern? The question struck home in a way that left many shifting uncomfortably in the pews. Mrs. Thornton, Frederick's wife, was the first to stand. "I won't sign," she announced, surprising her husband and everyone else. "Not because I don't have reservations, I do. But because that baby deserves better than to be a symbol in someone else's moral crusade." Others followed, first one, then several, then nearly half the congregation rising to signify their refusal to support the petition. Pastor Moore watched with dismay as his carefully orchestrated show of community opposition crumbled. James Henderson, reading the room with the political acumen that had made him successful in business, made a strategic pivot. "Perhaps," he suggested, "this is a matter best left to the proper authorities rather than community intervention. We all want what's best for the child, after all." It was a face-saving retreat, not a genuine change of heart, but Yorick recognized it for the opportunity it was. "That's all we've asked for," he acknowledged. "A fair evaluation of our fitness as parents without prejudice or presumption." The impromptu meeting gradually dispersed, the petition unsigned. As people filed out of the church, many paused to speak quietly to the Xaviers, some offering support, others simply acknowledging them with newfound respect. Pastor Moore was among the last to leave, his expression troubled as he approached them. "I still believe there are concerns about this arrangement," he said, "but perhaps I've been hasty in my judgment." "You're welcome to visit us, Pastor," Josephine offered, "to see for yourself how Sarah is thriving." The invitation was both genuine and strategic, a bridge extended across a divide that had seemed unbridgeable. The pastor nodded, his response non-committal but not hostile. Outside the church, Daniel bounced on his toes with barely contained excitement. "You did it," he exclaimed. "You showed them all." Yorick ruffled the boy's hair. "We still have to convince the territorial authority." "But the town won't be against you now," Violet pointed out. "That makes a difference." As if to punctuate her words, Sarah chose that moment to laugh, a bubbling, joyous sound that drew smiles from everyone nearby. She reached her chubby hands toward Daniel, who puffed up with importance at being the object of her attention. "See," he said, taking her tiny fingers in his. "She knows who her friends are." The shift in town sentiment, while not unanimous, was palpable in the weeks that followed. People who had previously avoided the Xaviers now greeted them on the street. Invitations to social gatherings resumed. Even Frederick Thornton, grudgingly acknowledging defeat, extended credit at the store without his usual disparaging comments. When the letter finally arrived from the territorial authority, nearly 2 months after Holbrook's visit, Yorick and Josephine sat together on the porch to read it, Sarah playing at their feet with wooden blocks Daniel had carved for her. "Whatever it says," Yorick said, his fingers hesitating on the seal, "we face it together." Josephine nodded, her throat too tight for words. He broke the seal and unfolded the official document, his eyes scanning the formal language until he found the crucial passage. When he looked up, tears glistened in his eyes. "They've approved our petition," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Sarah is legally ours, forever." Josephine's cry of joy brought Daniel running from the barn, his young face anxious until he saw their expressions. "They said yes?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "They said yes," Yorick confirmed, lifting Sarah high in the air, her delighted squeal a perfect expression of the joy flooding through all of them. In that moment of celebration, none of them noticed the rider approaching until the horse was nearly at the porch steps. It was Emma Rivers, returning as promised to visit her niece. "Good news?" she asked, noting their jubilant faces. "The best," Josephine replied, moving forward to welcome her. The adoption is official. Sarah is legally a Xavier. Emma dismounted, her expression serene. And also legally Rivers, she said. The letter I sent to the authorities specified that condition that she retain her mother's name as well as yours, Sarah Rivers Xavier. Yorick nodded, understanding the significance of this dual heritage. A perfect name for a child of two worlds. Emma reached for the baby, who went willingly into her aunt's arms, recognizing her from previous visits. "I've brought something," she said, producing a small buckskin pouch from her saddlebag. From it, she drew a delicate necklace of polished stones and carved wood. "This belonged to our mother, and then to Mary. Now it's Sarah's, a reminder of where she comes from." Josephine watched as Emma fastened the necklace around Sarah's neck, the simple beauty of the piece striking against the baby's fair skin. "We'll make sure she knows the stories that go with it," she promised. "All of her stories from both sides of her family." "I know you will," Emma said simply. "That's why I supported your adoption." The realization of how much Emma's letter had influenced the authorities' decision settled over them with profound gratitude. This woman, who had every cultural reason to oppose them, had chosen to see beyond boundaries to what truly mattered for her niece's well-being. "You'll always have a place in her life," Yorick assured her. "In our lives." As the sun set over the Idaho mountains, casting long shadows across the ranch, they shared a meal together not as adversaries or even reluctant allies, but as family united by love for one small girl. Daniel, who had been uncharacteristically quiet throughout the meal, finally spoke up. "Does this mean I can call her my sister now, officially?" The question caught them all by surprise. Josephine looked at Yorick, a new possibility dawning in her eyes. "Would you like that, Daniel?" Yorick asked carefully. Being Sarah's brother, the boy nodded, suddenly shy. "I mean, I'm here all the time anyway, and I help with chores, and she likes me." "She loves you," Josephine corrected gently. "We all do." "Mrs. Wilkerson says I'm too old for most folks to want adopting," Daniel continued, staring at his plate. "But maybe, if you wanted." He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. Yorick extended his hand across the table, resting it on the boy's thin shoulder. "Daniel," he said, "we'd be honored if you'd consider becoming a Xavier too, if that's something you want." The boy's eyes widened. "For real?" "Not just as a ranch hand or helper." "For real," Josephine confirmed, her heart expanding to encompass this unexpected addition to their family. "As our son." Daniel's face split into a grin so bright it rivaled the lantern light. "Yes, I mean if you're sure, if it's not too much trouble." "Family is never trouble," Emma observed quietly from her end of the table. "Only blessing." Later that night, after Emma had retired to the guest room and Daniel to his increasingly permanent spot in what had once been the spare bedroom, Josephine and Yorick stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching Sarah sleep. The moonlight filtered through the curtains, illuminating her peaceful face and the gentle rise and fall of her chest. "Did you ever imagine," Josephine whispered, "when the doctor told us we couldn't have children, that we'd end up with two?" Yorick's arm tightened around her waist. "I always knew we had enough love for a dozen, if needed." "They said I'd never bear you a child," she murmured, leaning into his embrace. He turned her to face him, his expression solemn in the silvery light. "And I told you then what I'll tell you now," he said, brushing a tender kiss against her forehead. "You already bore my heart. Everything else is a gift we never expected but will always cherish." As if sensing she was being discussed, Sarah stirred in her sleep, one tiny hand reaching out before settling again. Josephine moved to adjust her blanket, then returned to her husband's arms. "Our family," she said softly, wonderingly. "Not what we planned, but exactly what we needed." Not what anyone planned, Yorick agreed. But who's to say it wasn't God's plan all along? Through the open window came the night sounds of the Idaho wilderness coyotes calling in the distance, the whisper of wind through pine trees, the occasional lowing of cattle in the home pasture. Sounds that would form the backdrop of Sarah and Daniel's childhood. Part of the legacy the Xaviers would pass to children not of their blood but completely of their hearts. In the years that followed, the Xavier family became a fixture in Malad City, respected if not always fully understood. Sarah grew into a beautiful young woman who moved confidently between worlds, equally at home with her Aunt Emma's Shoshone teachings and the ranching skills her father imparted. Daniel, officially adopted within months of that pivotal night, developed into Yorick's right hand and eventual partner in an expanding cattle operation. And Josephine, who had once believed her inability to bear children made her less of a woman, discovered that motherhood had little to do with biology and everything to do with the capacity to love. The nursery that had stood empty and accusing became just the first of several bedrooms filled with children who needed homes, some staying briefly, others becoming permanent additions to the unconventional family that began with one tiny, unwanted baby, and the couple who dared to love her against all convention. On their 30th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and a community that had learned to see beyond its prejudices, Yorick raised a toast to his still beautiful wife. "To Josephine," he said, "who couldn't give me children but gave me a family beyond anything I could have imagined." "To love," she countered, her eyes meeting his across a table crowded with faces of various hues, all bearing the unmistakable mark of belonging, which always finds a way. And in that moment, every struggle, every tear, every battle fought for the right to love without boundaries seemed not just worthwhile but inevitable steps on a journey that had led them exactly where they were meant to be.